recording the call?
Yeah, it says Youri's recording the call. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And my guest today is Fiona Edwards. Fiona is a campaigner. She is a socialist, anti-racist, feminist, and anti-imperialist campaigner. Often covers Latin American affairs, and in recent years has been mobilizing against NATO and the U.S.-led Cold War against China, known as the Pivot to Asia. She is part of the International Committee of No Cold War and is a member of its UK-England chapter, No Cold War Britain, and often writes for Eyes on Latin America. And let's get into it. And we're going to be talking about, yes, the pivot to Asia and hopefully, if we have time, other topics. So first off, Miss Edwards, thanks so much for coming on the program and taking time out of your very busy schedule to come on.
Well, no, it's fantastic to join you. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Likewise, and well, let's get into it. The first question I wanted to ask you, and this, it's a stupid question, but because there are a lot of, but the reason why I'm asking this is because, you know, when it comes to NATO and the pivot to Asia, which we're going to talk about, there are a lot of left-leaning people or people who claim. People who claim to be leftists who do have an imperial blind spot when it comes to NATO. We saw this, with the war in Yugoslavia. We see this now. Ukraine has become such a toxic subject. That's divided the left. So my first question I wanted to ask you is can you explain to anyone who is living in Europe, Turtle Island, Britain and its neighbors, and even Australia and New Zealand, why, especially if they do consider themselves anti-war, anti-imperialist, why they should be opposed to NATO?
Well, to begin with, just to come into how you frame that question, when we're talking about the left, in the global north, you're spot on. There's a lot of confusion. There are people that have taken the right position to oppose NATO's warmongering and its increasing aggression, not just against Russia, but also China. But there's also been a lot of confusion, including in the labour movement, in the broader left. And that is not happening in the global south. The exact opposite is actually the case, that amongst the socialist left, right through to progressive left, all progressive forces really in the global south are clear that NATO is a threat to world peace. There's no idea that which has, I think it's breaking down in the global north, but some idea that NATO is a peace-loving defensive alliance. It's done nothing to provoke Russia in Ukraine, not really involved in a proxy war at all. This complete nonsense when actually even quite right-wing policy analysts in the United States have analysed that this is a deliberate policy of NATO expansion, which was understood to be a red line for Russia, to be a threat to its security interests, and it was a provoked war, and that's one of the first lies in the media, was that this was an unprovoked war. It was deliberate. This is what the United States wants. But I think in the outside of the global north, there is clarity about what NATO is. If you hear leaders in Latin America, leaders like Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, he's very clear, about let's have a peace negotiation in Ukraine. We want a war on poverty. We don't want these military wars. Other leaders like Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia, he's saying the main task for progressives across the world today is to build an alliance against NATO and the war machine. And so if we're going to break down what is NATO, it's an instrument of foreign policy for Washington, and it's an alliance of North America and Europe. And it's been expanding. It's been expanding eastwards at a time, it was set up during the Cold War. That was the original purpose. And rather than cease to exist after the collapse of the Soviet Union, what we've had is aggressive expansion eastwards, which was promised that it wouldn't happen by, the leading diplomats of the day. Between the United States and Russia, there was an agreement. But what has happened is this expansion eastwards, and including within, the attempt to get Ukraine to join NATO, and this is a red line, and this is involved because a lot of people say the war in Ukraine started in 2022. Well, actually, this is something that was brewing for a long time. There was actually already much lower level intensity war than we have today, but a low level intensity war in Ukraine, which followed the US organized coup in 2014 in the Donbass in the east of Ukraine. So people, the United Nations say 14,000 people died in that period of time. So there was already a war in Ukraine, and NATO has been there the whole time, provoking this, to create this situation. And if you listen to the leaders in the United States, for example, President Biden, they don't hide what they're trying to do. They say that the goal is to weaken Russia. Well, that's not that is going against the sovereignty of Russia. Why is that illegitimate to use another country to create a massive war to lead to tens of thousands of deaths? How is that a legitimate goal? It's not a legitimate goal.
And a quick follow-up then is, why do you think so many left-leaning folk, and again people who call themselves left-leaning leftists, why do you think so many of them fall for the propaganda that NATO is not only a force for good in the world, or the argument that often people make about the police, that the police are a necessary evil? Why do you think so many think that about NATO? And I mean, despite the fact that, if you look at what NATO did in Afghanistan and what NATO did in Libya, which is still a country which is engulfed in chaos because of NATO. So why do you think so many people that so many people still think that NATO's a force for good in the world, or that it's a necessary evil?
Well, I think that the situation in the global north, just to get a bit deeper into that, is that the imperialist ruling class are in control. They are in control in the global north. And the thing is in previous situations of major wars, for example, if you take the war in Iraq, there were real splits in essentially the NATO countries. Germany and France were against that war, the ruling classes, and that led to basically a split in the ruling class. So there was broader forces, let's say, in the world, in the global north, that were against that war. And what we've got now is one of the key aims of the Biden administration, which is different to the Trump administration previously. They both agree on having a Cold War, principally to stop the rise of China, but they have different ways of going about it. And one of the key features of Biden is to build an alliance internationally, but this is an alliance that's very focused in the global north. And that's where Biden actually has had success in his term in office, in getting more and more hostility from global north countries against both China and Russia. So you have seen a capitulation of European leaders to this whole agenda. The billions and billions of euros that have been flowing in to sustain the proxy war from European powers. The fact that Germany is increasing its GDP, that it's spending on the military to 2% a year. That's been a long fought out thing with the United States. Have been pushing that for a long time. Now Germany is proposing to do that. That they also agreed last year to increase the budget that year by 100 billion euros. Similar process in France from 2017 to 2030. The plan that is underway is to double France's military spending. So you've really seen a really right-wing shift in Europe, where the United States agenda has gained more and more traction, and part of that has been blanket propaganda. An attempt to really push out through all avenues of the media the idea that the main enemy is Russia and China to humanity. They need to be stopped. They're a threat to Western values. They're a threat to democracy, etc., etc. And to try and soften up public opinion for this process of remilitarization, for Cold War and hot war. And unfortunately, we have seen a lack of response from the left and progressive movements. We shouldn't be despairing to say it doesn't exist. It does exist. There are some minority forces, but we need to acknowledge we're in a minority in the global north. But I always say internationally, we're in a majority. So we need to not lose sight of the fact that we're part of an international movement. But the other thing is those smaller voices that we do have, they're constantly censored. They're constantly, harassed. There's an attempt to smear people. There's a witch hunt. There's this new McCarthyism that's taking place, which is trying to say, if you oppose the proxy war of NATO in Ukraine, you're a stooge for Putin. If you don't want a nuclear war with China, you're just promoting pro-Communist Party of China propaganda. This is obviously ludicrous. It's in the interest of the majority of humanity, including people in the global north, to not have hot wars with Russia or China, which could escalate into nuclear war. That should be very obvious to everyone. But there is a real clampdown in the global north, increasing clampdowns against free speech and a different opinion, even when it's in independent media, and it's not even, let alone in the mainstream media, which is it's not even allowed to get a fair hearing in that. So I think that's kind of what's going on. I think there is definitely the case that you know, a lot of left are just going along with the pressure that there is in these countries, and those that aren't going along with that pressure from imperialism there's an attempt to silence them. But I think we should be encouraged that a lot of people, even though they are in a minority, are still seeing the truth and speaking out, and we should, you know, build on that really.
That's fantastic, and hopefully we get a chance to talk about that. So then I have to ask them this question, which is, you know, explain to people, you know, what the pivot to Asia is and why folks, especially leftists, should be organized, that they should be organizing mass demonstrations against, you know, this new Cold War on China.
Absolutely. Well, this is something which has defined US foreign policy for quite some time. President Barack Obama started off the pivot to Asia over 10 years ago now. But really, the escalation against China in terms of the US really took up another gear when President Donald Trump became president of the United States. We had all these tariffs, the economic war against China, the sanctions, the propaganda war, and that really reached a bit of a crescendo really under COVID, where it's, you know, the China COVID it's the China flu. Yeah, it's good that I've forgotten the right wing smears. I can't even remember them, but they were everywhere. You know, China is the, you know, all these racist ideas that China is a country that's producing this virus, etc., and it's got a unique thing. It's all a racist narrative essentially. And then what happened? Obviously, Trump lost the election, Biden became president, and that policy has continued, and it's ratcheted up in many ways. I mean, we hear a lot of stuff about the threat that China poses to the global north. I mean, well, first of all, as has been said very many times, there's only one country in the world that has 800 military bases around the world, 400 of which surround China, and that country is called the United States of America. You will find that China does not have any military bases surrounding the United States. It doesn't have any military bases surrounding Europe. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, you know, so we've got this military buildup already, but that's being escalated. So this year, there's been so many developments in Asia in terms of what the United States are trying to do, which is to disrupt the peace, because what's really defined Asia for the last 4 decades is development and peace. And so the United States is going in there with an agenda to disrupt that and promote instability. So you've got an agreement with Japan. Japan's now remilitarizing. They're going to double military spending over the next 5 years. That's an incredibly threatening development. You've got the US opening up new military bases in Japan, in the Philippines. You've also got this AUKUS deal between the United States, Britain, and Australia, and that's, I think it's going to cost Australia over 380 billion Australian dollars, and that's about getting Australia to have nuclear-powered submarines. This is all part of the build-up against China. There's thankfully opposition within Australia to this development because it's extremely expensive and it's extremely dangerous to do that. You know, China poses no threat to Australia. And then you've got other developments taking place, and for example, the United States has been trying to get Tokyo to open up a NATO liaison office. This has actually been vetoed by President. This has been vetoed by President Macron, so it's on the back burner now. And they're also been trying to get India into NATO, and India go, we don't want anything to do with this. But the United States has definitely been escalating its military buildup against China, and they're particularly focusing. There's a number of flashpoints, but particularly focusing on Taiwan. So obviously, there's loads of news coverage about Taiwan. What you don't really read very much in the Western media is one fact, and this is the main fact people need to know about Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. The overwhelming majority of countries in the world recognize that reality. And so all of this discussion that the United States poses is, China's a threat to Taiwan. No. The United States is a threat to China, including Taiwan, and they're trying to stoke up tensions. They're trying to funnel in arms, and they're trying to provoke an international crisis and potentially a hot war over this. But this is an attack on China's sovereignty, and that is very controversial to say in the global north, in countries like Britain and the United States. But it doesn't stop it being the truth. Just because it's controversial, it is the truth. But here is
or controversial, as I would say.
Yeah, it's like the media is just trying to rewrite what is the reality, which is, you know, even the United States policy is to recognize there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China. So you've got all of this, and they are really sending in arms into Taiwan, and they're supporting, even though they claim that their policy is still to support one China, and we hope that is the case. There's a lot of moves that they're making which is undermining that policy, you know, really putting in the arms, supporting separatist movements. So that is very concerning. So, you know, they've already created war in Europe with this NATO expansion, and the concern is that they want to spread war to Asia and around China as being the principal target. So I think we're living in a very dangerous time, and this is all, you know, how is this being funded? It's just happening at the same time there's enormous economic crisis in global north countries. Look at what's happening in Europe, the United States. We've got stagnant economies, attacks on living standards, austerity policies. People are, you know, getting poorer. And but there is always a magic money tree for war. We've got billions going to Ukraine, billions going to fund this military buildup against China. We've got Britain and other countries in Europe sending warships to the South China Sea. What on earth is the purpose of that, apart from to send a signal to Beijing? What kind of signal? And it costs loads of money. So I think, you know, this is where we need to start in terms of building a movement. Is like, this is not in the interest of the people in the countries who have got governments that are you know, leading us to potentially to World War III with China.
And that's a perfect segue to this to this question, which is, can you respond to the allegations and arguments that some leftists make that you already sort of answered this, but expand on it a bit more. You know, because some leftists say that China is a rival capitalist, that it's a rival capitalist / rival imperialist nation in the world, specifically in Africa. And if you reject the thesis of that argument, please explain why.
Okay, yeah, I mean, you know, when we're opposing this war, on this Cold War and potential hot war on China, we need the broadest possible alliance. You don't have to believe, everyone doesn't need to agree on everything in terms of analysis, but I think it's very important to understand who the aggressor is. The aggressor is Washington. They want a Cold War, potentially a hot war. China doesn't want that. And in terms of your question, there's a false equivalence that's often put forward, just like by people that on the left actually included, which is neither Washington nor Beijing. Now I'm just going to go into
exactly.
So I'm going to go into Latin America as the example. I mean, you raised Africa. There's loads of examples that could be given on this, but I recently went to Nicaragua to celebrate the 44th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. I went in July, and it was very, very interesting because I actually put this question, you know, what about the Cold War II trade union leader who's also a member of the National Assembly, and he said, you know, you've got a lot of media coverage trying to let us know that all over the world that you know, Russia and China are the aggressors. And he said, US troops have been on our soil 7 times, so we know who the aggressor is, and obviously China and Russia haven't. And he said, you know, the first country in the world to give us vaccines when the global north were hoarding vaccines was Russia, and the second was Cuba. And then we went on to have a discussion about China. And so, I mean, people that don't know the history of Nicaragua or Latin America more broadly, it's really mired by US intervention, US domination, and essentially, you know, if the United States doesn't like a government, it tries to organize a coup, whether it's a military coup or a soft coup, like happened recently in the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. And actually, in Nicaragua, there was recently a coup attempt. In 2018, there was a coup attempt, caused huge disruption, a massive economic crisis. So it's very clear the United States approach to Nicaragua is, we don't like your government, you know, we don't like that you want to have your own policies, your own foreign policy, so we're going to try and overthrow you. That's very clear what the United States project is. They have done nothing to help develop Nicaragua at all. On the contrary, have waged coups, contra wars, funded and supported dictators, decades and decades of intervention. So what's the experience with China? Well, just this April, what's happened is there's a joint venture, a joint deal where Nicaragua and China are building housing projects with all of the supporting infrastructure. Nicaragua has just joined the Belt and Road Initiative, which over 150 countries across the world have joined. And what's coming with that is, China's coming in to provide investment and expertise to build infrastructure, hospitals, transport, ports, etc., etc. The United States doesn't do that. And you can look at other countries as well, like in Latin America developments this year. In Bolivia, it's very well known that Bolivia's got one of the biggest lithium reserves in the world. And the United States tried to have a coup they did have a coup against Evo Morales in order to try and control that. And people might remember Elon Musk, the famous billionaire that owns Twitter. He said, yeah, we will coup whoever we want in relation to Bolivia, because they wanted to control of the lithium, so that could be extracted and used for companies like Tesla and everything else. Because lithium is a very important component in 21st century technology. It's in all the phones. It's very important for batteries, etc., etc. So, what is happening now is that Bolivian state companies are doing deals with China and Russia to not just extract lithium and export it abroad, which is the model that happens in the United States, but to produce it within Bolivia and create industry within Bolivia. So you've not got this underdeveloped situation where they're just mining the resources, flying out the country, but there is a leveling up, a value-added component happening within Bolivia itself, so that the economy develops. And that's completely different to what the United States has offered Latin America. And so, what China offers is win-win development. Obviously, in these situations, it's not like China's not a charity. They're like, let's do business, let's do a deal. They're getting something out of it, but so is Nicaragua, Bolivia, or any other global South country that they're working with. And that's the difference. Whereas the United States come in and say, you need to privatize this, you need to privatize that. China's coming in and working with state companies to develop, to provide infrastructure and to develop. And so that is a huge difference. That's a massive difference in terms of the differences between domination and cooperation, and whether or not you're going to respect the sovereignty of other countries. Because the other thing is, China doesn't organize coups. It doesn't overthrow governments. And that's a massive difference. So I think that this whole attempt to say they're just the same is absolutely ludicrous. And you also have the same, it's like, China's just any old other country. It's like, well, what other country in the world's just lifted 850 billion people out of poverty in a 40-year time span? This is a historic, amazing historic feat. And it's just not really resonated with a lot of people in the global north yet, that this is happening, because this is history in the making. This is a phenomenal advance of human rights.
It's interesting that you say that, because yeah, indeed, because I believe China is a member of the World Trade Organization and so forth. But that being said, as you mentioned, like you never hear stories about how China is passing laws or is forcing an African state, whether it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government or something in between, or a Latin American state, which these days there's a growing, left-wing tide, pink tide. But you never ever hear stories about, some Chinese mining company and the Chinese state trying to overthrow the government of Congo so that they could exploit, its minerals. I mean, yeah, there are Chinese businesses that do that, but they don't try to pass structural adjustments programs through like whatnot in order to undermine such and such a state so that it can continue to be a client state for Chinese businesses. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the model, the Chinese foreign policy is non-interference and respect for sovereignty, and the track record of that is what wars has China launched. Who's responsible for the war in terror? It's not China. How many coups has China organized? Zero. So it's a practice that it's a doctrine. They have a foreign policy doctrine which is backed up by the facts of what they're doing. They've not brought war to Latin America. They're bringing hospitals, housing, infrastructure. In Bolivia, they launched a rocket so that Bolivia has internet. They launched a satellite with one of their rockets so that Bolivia has
interesting.
Internet. Yeah.
Okay. So then I have to ask this question. That's a perfect segue into this question, which is one of the major difficulties in anti-war slash anti-imperialist, campaigning is just the avalanche of propaganda that we're subjected to with our corporate media and our state media. It could be ABC Australia, TVNZ, DW, France 24, BBC, CBC, and PBS, in the US. And one of the most difficult parts of that propaganda is when the ruling elites use what I call half truths. So that being said, what are some of the half truths leveled at China that you can think of that the movement you're part of is involved in trying to overcome when we're trying to get people to mobilize against the pivot to Asia, NATO, and the next and the next imperial wars that that our ruling classes are planning to manufacture.
Well, I mean, I think what we've got is quite a lot of outright lies. I mean, it's hard to sort of even know where to start. I mean, but some of the, just give you an example of some of the propaganda. So Joe Biden recently said in a speech, attacking China, that China's got an economic growth rate of 2%. This is the president of the United States saying China's growing by 2%, but it's growing by 5.5%. So there's just outright lies. We have situations of a really clever, not so clever really, but quite funny, amusing, but absurd device that the Western media use is, China's brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but at what cost? As if this is a terrible situation.
In fact, sorry to interrupt. The left critics of China would say, yes, China has lifted millions of people out of extreme poverty, but they did it because they allowed Western corporations like Apple, Microsoft, and whatnot to heavily exploit their labor and to use people for cheap labor. They'll talk about suicides of workers and so forth. So yeah, so that's one of the things that left critics would use against China, and then how would you respond to that? Because that is sort of like a half truth, but isn't really relevant to the current situation in China, where they don't really allow anymore that kind of exploitative business in their country, right?
Well, I mean, the thing is when we're building an anti-war movement, a whole range of analysis can exist in a united front, because we need a massive united front, and not everyone's going to agree. But my personal point of view is that's a complete load of rubbish, really. I mean, a lot of the left, they reproduce a lot of the left that you're describing. They reproduce claims that are put in the Western media. They regurgitate it with a few left phrases here or there. But I mean, for example, most recent economic data is, in terms of China's economic growth, growing really impressively through the pandemic. So let me just go through a few statistics with you. Last 4 years, the Chinese economy grew 2.5 times as fast as the United States and 180 times as fast as Britain. Right. So what does that look like in terms of people's living standards? Because GDP growth, what does that mean? Well, in real terms, China's annual wage growth was in the last year was 4.7%. In Britain, it was 0.1%. So, when people are coming out of poverty, and a lot of the left will dismiss, 850 billion people out of extreme poverty. Oh, who cares? Well, that's actually a massive number of people. And
especially for an overpopulous country like China.
Yeah, and I mean, within China, they don't say, they have declared a victory saying, well, we've eliminated absolute poverty, but they don't say, and that's the end of the story. They have their plans to move forward. They want to become a moderately prosperous economy. That's what they're saying. And so the US is trying to stop that. Let's just be clear. This whole thing against China is stopping their economic development. They want to stop that happening. So the idea, and so it's not the case that China are saying absolutely everything is perfect. No one, I think supporters of China don't think everything is perfect. There's a journey, but you have to see where China's come from. In 1949, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. They had a life expectancy of about 36 years old. That has doubled since then. It's gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to becoming a superpower. And of course there is inequality in China. There is a need to improve living standards still, but that is not something that the Chinese leadership even, or the Chinese media pretend doesn't exist. I mean, one of the big debates in China in the last couple of years has been the need to crack down on billionaires, the need to have common prosperity, that you can't have inequality in society. So there are huge problems that need to be solved. China's a massive country, it's a complex country, it's under attack, there's this massive economic war, but you are seeing within China a big debate on these issues about how you can raise people's living standards and stuff. And I think all of this is actually kind of not fully understood or even engaged with on the Western left. People will read just Western sources about what's going on in China, and they won't read a single thing from the Chinese left, which is the biggest left in the world, and there's a denial of that. There's a denial that there's even a left in China. And it's like, well, I think if you raise 850 million people out of poverty, I think you deserve to be called the left. I mean, it's just obscene, so I think that so I think that there's a lot of distortion, especially when people are just getting their sources from the Western media. But yeah, I think there's a real underestimation, because people's living standards in the global north are so high, even amongst the working class comparatively to the global south, that they just can't get their head around what it means to go from being in absolute poverty to not being in absolute poverty. But in the global south, that resonates, because people do want running water, they do want high-speed rail, they do want to be able to have a pension, to retire, to go on holidays, to enjoy all the things that you can in China, which you couldn't before. And none of that should be taken for granted. These are huge, huge leaps forward.
That's a perfect segue actually to this question, which is, now, even if China is, according to its, and I like what you say about how people in the left in like Latin America, and even the radical left in Africa, they don't the way they see China and China's rise in the world is completely different from the kind of Western left criticism of China. So that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, okay, even if China is, according to its leftist critics and others who don't want to see an escalation of the pivot to Asia, because they see China as capitalist. But okay, even if that's true, that China is this capitalist country, or China is a socialist country that allows a mixed economy, which is almost like any social democratic government. Again, explain to people how that doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter, because and why they need to protest efforts against our ruling class to set up a possible war with China. Because I'll just say this final thing. Because oftentimes, when we think of Western imperialism, we think of, as you mentioned, we think of Nicaragua, we think of Haiti, we think of any country in Latin America which has a left reformist government, and then that gets overthrown by the capitalist scum of the United States, Britain, France, Canada, and whatnot. But even when we look at Eastern Europe, like Viktor Yanukovych, like, yeah, he wasn't a lefty, he wasn't a social democratic, he wasn't a social democrat, he was a center-right government, but that didn't stop the West from overthrowing his government, installing their own right-wing government, and now we see this this cluster F of a situation in in Ukraine. So respond to those on the left who say that, oh well, China's a capitalist country, and therefore I don't want to really mobilize against a war on a war against them, but I do want to not see any escalation of of a new Cold War on China.
Well, there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I mean, the first thing is, who is the aggressor in the situation? And that's the key question. That's whether you come into the intersection of this neither Washington nor Beijing. You can't mount an argument that says Beijing is the aggressor, that is threatening the United States, Britain, Europe. It's not the case. That is a non-existent situation. Same with Australia. So there is that false narrative that needs to be understood. So if you understand that it's the United States that wants this Cold War, it's the country that has 800 military bases abroad, 400 surrounding China, that's upgrading its military system, that spends so much more than China on the military, is preparing for war, has generals, US generals predicting war by 2025. You know, it is the countries in the global north that are upgrading their strategic defense papers, which are identifying China as either a threat or a systemic rival, or the greatest threat or the greatest challenge of the 21st century. All of this is happening in our countries, in the global north. If you live in a global north country, if you live in the United States, in Britain, anywhere in Europe where this is happening, the enemy is at home. The responsibility is upon us to hold our own governments to account. Our own governments are dedicating billions to this military buildup. They are preparing potentially for a hot war with China. There's already a proxy hot war with Russia. And is this the path that people want to go down? Do they want a lot of their money to go into this, which is not going into healthcare, that's not going into education, that's not going into wages, because living standards are dramatically falling in the global north. And moreover, do you want to have a potential nuclear war, which could destroy the entire human race? At the same time, we've got another existential threat taking place, which is climate change, and hardly anything is being done in the global north, which is the most responsible for this crisis, to tackle it. And again, do you want to stop, you know, climate Armageddon? You know,
militarism, you know, supporting. Yeah. You know, supporting a U.S. military alliance, which is what NATO is. I mean, the military is like the number 3 biggest polluter in the world. So having these having these ridiculous, you know, Cold Wars on a physical level, like what we see with Libya, but even on just like a ridiculous, you know, like spending 2% of our GDP, that's just another nail in the coffin when it comes to fighting against climate change.
Exactly. And so I would just say, look at your own self-interest. Look at what is in the interest of the people in this country. It is not to go down this road, because if you don't care anything about China, you think China's irrelevant. Well, this whole approach of increasing aggression on China is stopping you from getting your wages increase. It's stopping you from getting the funding for the NHS, because there's a whole ideological thing too. It's like, let's not look at the real problems that we need to face. Let's create a new problem, which is let's all confront China. And so it's a huge issue to understand that China isn't our enemy. And that's the key thing. You don't need to support China. You can hate China. You can have all your criticisms of it. But is China our enemy? Is China a country you want to have a hot war with, or go to World War III with, or have all of these economic policies against, which are not in our interest, because we're losing jobs, we're losing investment, that it's the most dynamic economy in the world? Why wouldn't we want to have a cooperation when Britain is going downhill on the economy, one of the poorest performing economies in the developed world? Why wouldn't you cooperate with a country which poses no threat to us and is moving forward?
Fantastic response. And actually, before I get to my second to last question, because I do have some time, so I do have to ask. So I do have to ask this, which is, can you explain? You know, when we, you know, because in this pivot to Asia, you know, it's not just about, you know, about mobilizing the military, but it's also supporting very, very reactionary policies in South Korea and Japan. And can you talk about what, you know, what the pivot to Asia means for a place like Okinawa or Jeju, or like, Okinawa in Japan and Jeju Island in Korea, and also when a country like Britain, which is I think one of the 5th largest economies in the world, what spending 2% of its GDP does to the to the struggling middle class and the working class / working poor, you know, at home in your country.
Yeah, well, I would recommend something that No Cold War International has done, which a couple of years ago we did a webinar called For a Peaceful Pacific, which had experts on the situation in the islands in East Asia, which you were mentioning. But I mean, you know, the key thing is, you know, the presence of the US military in this area. It's a huge environmental impact. It has a huge social impact, which is very negative. And of course, the key thing is increasing all this military presence. Is they're trying to drag Japan into a confrontation with China, and they're trying to drag South Korea into one as well. I mean, that's the key thing. But I would say, in terms of more of the detail of the thing you were asking about, the situation on the ground. I think it is very important to be listening to voices from the region. There is, if you go onto the No Cold War YouTube channel, there's a really good webinar called Peaceful Pacific, where we hear voices that are never ever heard in the mainstream media. And then in terms of Britain, I mean, we've got a stagnant economy, but the one budget that's growing, we've got austerity across the board, savage austerity, but the one budget that's growing is the military spending. It says it all. They've got a magic money tree for war.
For that, right?
Say again?
A magic money tree for that.
Yes, exactly. I think it's every is it Storm Shadow or Shadow Storm? I get it mixed up. There's a missile that's being sent from Britain to Ukraine. Each one of them is worth 2 million. It's and you can go through that on the tanks, the depleted uranium, and all the money that's being used into this. This is being taken away from other areas of spending.
Unbelievable. And I think we're almost done, so I have to ask this question. But yeah, and another thing I wanted to add, though, when we talk about Taiwan, because that's another thorny topic, it seems. But I think more and more people are starting to understand that the whole China is committing genocide against the Uyghur peoples. A lot of that was was a load of nonsense, and that the movement of Hong Kong independence was a very, very reactionary movement. And I think when we talk about Taiwan, which is another thorny topic, I would just say that even for those who do believe in Taiwanese, independence, I personally think that, okay, just to settle this subject, I think Taiwan, should have, a referendum, but that's just, my opinion. But when we talk about Taiwanese independence, I was very shocked to learn from a comrade of mine who's been on this program, who shares her name, Fiona, and Fiona was explaining to me that you should look more into what Taiwanese independence means, because it doesn't mean just you have this province of China becoming an independent country. No, what the United States is doing, what Britain is doing, its allies, is actually supporting a very reactionary movement, which is very right-wing, very, capitalist, and that movement sees themselves as the real Chinese government. So they would actually like to see, not only them being recognized, but actually an overthrow of the entire government of mainland China, so that they could be, like a Japan or a Philippines or Indonesia or South Korea, just, another just obedient ally to the United States. Can you talk about that briefly?
Well, it's a very dangerous fantasy, because the reality is, I think we'll see there's elections coming up next year in Taiwan, and we'll see that actually there's different political trends within Taiwan. Not all Taiwanese people want to have, this very bellicose policy against the mainland and in favor of separatism. Actually, there are other political currents political parties that want to maintain a cooperative relationship, and so. It's a fantasy. It's never going to happen. I think this is exactly what the United States did with Russia. They know that Russia's not going to tolerate a state joining NATO that shares this massive border with it and have nuclear weapons within 5-minute flight time of Moscow. They're just not going to accept it. And China is not going to accept the United States intervening to separate a province of China from China. It's a red line, just like it was with the United States. So I think. What the United States is trying to do is create the conditions for a hot war in that region, in the Pacific. That's what they want to do. And I think China does want to avoid that situation, obviously. And most countries in the region want to avoid that issue. But it's a question of US meddling. Why is the United States, how many miles away is the United States? What's it got to do with them? But they have this agenda of creating instability and a potential war, and it's all to weaken China. But I think this idea that you could have a separatist movement in Taiwan that then would be in a position to overthrow the situation in mainland China is a fantasy.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And my second to last question I wanted to ask you is, I wanted to know how you, as a as a leftist feminist, a queer liberationist, and someone who is an anti-racist campaigner, how do you deal with the toxic debate of identity politics versus class struggle? And when you're in those conversations, I imagine with mostly white male leftists, but others who subscribe to that approach, class reductionist, how do you explain this is how we chew gum and walk at the same time? And I ask this especially in light of the growing transphobia that's happening in the UK and elsewhere. And also many leftists, they also seem just to recycle and prop up a lot of far-right grifters and arguments when it comes to stuff like, oh, I'm tired of hearing about identity politics, or engaging in a lot of, very, regressive politics.
Well, that's a massive question, so I'll try and keep it short. But as you say, I'm a socialist, and for me, socialism is about the liberation of humanity. And I think anyone with any knowledge of humanity will understand that, a majority of humanity are women, a majority of humanity are black or non-white, whichever terminology you want to use. There's a huge LGBT community across the world, disabled people. One of the key things of socialism is to fight against exploitation and oppression. It's about liberation. So, I think it's absolutely key. Class struggle issue is how I would define it, to fight against sexism, homophobia, transphobia, racism, disability discrimination. We have to stand with all oppressed, and obviously those that are facing oppression from imperialism in nations that are oppressed as well. So I think that's the ABC, maybe it's not quite ABC, but it's close to ABC of socialism, to stand with all humanity. And and also practically, when we're building an anti-war movement, we have to have a movement that's inclusive of women, of black people, of LGBT people. We need a massive movement. We need a mass movement against this war drive. So why would you cast aside the majority of the population, which is, in these categories of women, black people, etc. So.
Perfect. And all right, we end the program with the questionnaire. It's done by Marcel Proust, later the French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and later my hero, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. So, Ms. Edwards, it's your turn to do this. So here it goes.
Right,
what is your favorite word?
My favorite word?
Yeah, favorite word.
Socialism.
Then what's your least favorite word?
Imperialism.
Then what turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Say that again.
What turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally? What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Turns me on. Listening to music.
Okay, then what turns you off then?
Ignorance.
All right, and what sound or noise do you love?
What? Say again.
What sound or noise do you love?
Say that again. I can't hear what you mean.
What sound or noise do you love? What sound or noise do you love?
Summer.
Sound. What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, right. Sound. What sounds do I like?
Yeah.
Rustling of the trees.
Well, okay. Oh, that's a good response. And then, what sound or noise do you dislike then?
Oh, I don't know if I should reveal that. No. Definitely. Yeah. Nails on the blackboard type of screeching. I don't like.
Okay. That. And then, what's your favorite curse word?
Oh, I can't say that on the podcast.
Well, is it
probably the one that begins with F. Probably the one that begins with F and ends in K. So.
Okay, fantastic. Then, what profession would you love to do if you weren't doing if you weren't doing the fantastic work you do? What profession would you love to do?
Well, I greatly admire the medical profession, but I have no aptitude for it. But yeah, that's a great thing to do with your life, I think.
And then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Banker.
Boy, you really are a flaming left-winger.
Although they don't do much work, do they? Let's be honest. But yes.
Exactly. And Final question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you are an atheist, feel free to, feel free to answer.
Well, I am, what am I wanting God to say? When...
Yeah. What would you like to hear God or any of the deities?
Okay.
Assuming that there are multiple ones.
Maybe an offer of a cup of tea or something.
All right, I could go with that.
Just because it might be a bit tiring to have got there, so might want to refresh with a cup of tea.
All righty. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Fiona Edwards, who is a socialist, anti-racist, feminist, anti-imperialist, who writes for Eyes on Latin America and covers Latin America affairs. She's part of No Cold War and No Cold War Britain. Miss Edwards, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations that we have, and all my luck to you, and keep doing the brilliant work you're doing, because we are having a hard time mobilizing the anti-war movement, and the fact that you spend a lot of your time mobilizing people to be against the pivots Asia NATO, can't thank you enough for that. So thank you so much for coming on the program.
It's been a real pleasure to join you, Youri, and thanks so much, and keep up the brilliant work that you're doing as well. And thank you.